June 4th, 1942, 10:22 a.m. High above the middle of the Pacific Ocean, Lieutenant Commander Dusty Cleiss, a U.S. Navy dive bomber pilot, rolls his SBD Dauntless into a screaming 70-degree dive. His target, the Japanese aircraft carrier Kaga. Thousands of feet below him, the Kaga's deck is crowded with Zeros, torpedo bombers, and fuel lines. It is a perfect floating tinderbox. Kleiss's bomb, a 500-pounder, hits the deck surrounded by fueled aircraft. The explosion is catastrophic. It ignites a chain reaction of fuel, bombs, and torpedoes, tearing the ship apart from the inside. At that exact same moment, dive bombers from the USS Enterprise are doing the same thing to the carriers Akagi and Soryu. In the span of just 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the pride of the Kido Butai, the very ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor, are turned into blazing, sinking funeral pyres. This is the story everyone knows. The miracle at Midway, the single decisive battle won by brave pilots and brilliant codebreakers that turned the tide of the Pacific War. But that story, while true, hides a much bigger and more terrifying truth. The American victory wasn't a miracle. It was a deadline. The battle itself was a desperate gamble, but the outcome of the war, that was never in doubt. Here is the real question. In that battle, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers. The United States lost 1, the USS Yorktown. Why was this loss an unrecoverable, fatal blow to Japan, but a replaceable, temporary setback for the United States? The answer isn't found in the cockpit of a dive bomber. It's found in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the shipyards of Newport News, and the industrial spreadsheets that predicted Japan's doom before the first shot was even fired. 6 months earlier, just after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of that attack, wrote in his diary, he was not celebrating. He was warning his government. Yamamoto had been a naval attaché in Washington. He had seen the American factories. He had toured the Ford River Rouge plant. He knew what America was. He famously warned, "I can run wild for 6 months or a year with the decisive victory, but should the war be prolonged for 2 or 3 years, I have no confidence in our ultimate victory." Pearl Harbor was December 7th, 1941. The Battle of Midway was June 4th, 1942. The 6 months were up. Yamamoto's fear was not about fighting spirit. It was about math, and the math was brutal. In 1941, the industrial capacity of the United States was 10 times larger than that of the Japanese Empire. Let's talk about steel, the blood of modern warfare. In a good year, Japan could produce 7 or 8 million tons of steel. In 1943, the United States produced 80 million tons of steel. But the most critical bottleneck was shipbuilding. Japan had 3, maybe 4 major shipyards capable of building a fleet carrier: Yokosuka, Kure, and Kawasaki. That was it. The United States had a dozen, from Newport News in Virginia to the New York Navy Yard to Bethlehem Steel in Massachusetts. And that was before men like Henry Kaiser began building new yards on the West Coast. This exposed 2 totally different industrial philosophies. Japan's philosophy was that of the master craftsman. Their shipyards were filled with skilled artisans who built warships like works of art.
Each ship was a custom-built masterpiece perfected over years. America's philosophy was that of the mass producer. They built warships like they built refrigerators and Ford cars. They used standardized parts, prefabrication, and assembly lines. Japan was building a perfect navy. America was building a disposable one. This fundamental difference in philosophy is what made the 6 minutes at Midway so fatal.
Let's look at the 4 ships Japan lost at Midway: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were not just ships, they were national treasures, the product of decades of work. How long did they take to build? Kaga, laid down in 1920, took 6 years to complete. Akagi, laid down in 1920, took 4 years to complete. Even their modern carriers, the Shokaku and Zuikaku, which were not at Midway, were a colossal national effort. Shokaku took 44 months. Zuikaku took 45 months. The average construction time for a Japanese fleet carrier was over 4 years. This means that at 10:28 a.m. on June 4, 1942, in the span of 6 minutes, Japan lost 17 years of construction time. It was a loss they could not and would not ever replace. Now look at the American side. The U.S. lost the USS Yorktown. It was a tragic loss of a fine ship and brave men. But what was happening back in America? When Yorktown sank, the United States had 17 new fleet carriers already laid down or on order. These were the ships of the Essex class, and they were being built with a speed that Japan simply could not comprehend. The USS Essex itself was laid down in April 1941. She was commissioned in December 1942. Total construction time, 20 months. Japan's fastest-built carrier of the war, the Taiho, took 32 months. The U.S. was building a larger, more capable carrier in 37% less time. This is the brutal, hidden truth of Midway. When Japan lost its 4 carriers, its replacement pipeline was 1 ship, the Taiho. When America lost 1 carrier, its replacement pipeline was 17. In fact, the Americans were commissioning Essex-class carriers so fast they had to start reusing names of lost ships. The USS Lexington, CV-2, was sunk in May 1942. The new USS Lexington, CV-16, was commissioned in February 1943, less than a year later. The Yorktown, CV-5, was sunk in June 1942. The new USS Yorktown, CV-10, was commissioned in April 1943. Japan lost ships they could never replace. America lost ships that were already being replaced.
But the ships, as devastating a loss as they were, weren't the worst part. The real, unreplaceable loss was the software, the pilots. Just like their ships, Japan's naval aviators were master craftsmen. The Kido Butai that attacked Pearl Harbor and fought at Midway had the finest, most experienced, most deadly naval aviators in the world. But this force was a samurai class. It was a tiny,
elite group of men who had spent years in brutal, uncompromising training. It took a minimum of 2 years to create one Japanese naval aviator. They were, quite literally, irreplaceable. America's training philosophy was, again, mass production. While Japan was training a few hundred artists, the U.S. Navy was building a massive industrial-scale training pipeline in places like Pensacola, Florida, and Corpus Christi, Texas. The American plan was not to create 1,000 perfect pilots. It was to create 50,000 good-enough pilots. At the Battle of Midway, Japan lost over 2,500 men. This number included hundreds of their most veteran, elite pilots, navigators, and skilled maintenance chiefs. This was the core of their entire naval aviation program, and in one battle it was wiped out. Japan could not replace these men. They didn't have the fuel. They didn't have the instructors. They didn't have the time. From 1943 onward, new Japanese pilots were being sent into combat with less than 100 flight hours. They were being sent to their deaths against American pilots who had 300, 400, or 500 hours of training. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in 1944 wasn't a fair fight. It was the inevitable result of a craftsman training program collapsing against a mass production one.
So let us return to the miracle. The code breaking was brilliant, the pilots were heroic, the 6 minutes were undeniably decisive. But Midway was not the cause of Japan's defeat. It was simply the moment that Japan's inevitable industrial defeat became clear. It was the deadline. Yamamoto's 6 months were up, and the American industrial giant, the sleeping giant he so feared, was beginning to open its eyes. The timeline after Midway tells the whole story. Japan. After Midway, Japan scrambled. They laid down the Unrecoverable class, a cheaper design. They started converting merchant ships and battleship hulls into flimsy, slow, stopgap carriers. It wasn't enough. The Taiho, their only true fleet carrier, was finally commissioned in March 1944. She was sunk 3 months later in her first battle. America. After Midway, the floodgates opened. In 1943 alone, America commissioned 11 Essex-class carriers. Essex, Yorktown II, Intrepid, Lexington II, Bunker Hill, Hornet II, Franklin, one after another, an unstoppable tide of steel. By 1944, Admiral Ozawa, standing on the bridge of the Taiho, looked at the intelligence reports. The Americans had 17 fleet carriers. Japan had 9 total. The math was over. Midway was not a miracle that saved America. Midway was a single battle that revealed a pre-written industrial destiny. The battle was won by dive bombers, but the war was won by the blast furnaces of Pennsylvania, the welding torches of Virginia, and the relentless, unstoppable logic of the assembly line.